Let's get connected. See what I did there? All right, last time was just an intro, so let's really get into things a bit deeper today. Start by pulling up your JavaScript editor, which for me, I'm going to use Alt F, but you can also just go into Window and JavaScript editor right there. So we know from last time that we can create primitives using API.primitive, and then in quotations, put what you want. So in my case, a rectangle, then the name. So we'll just call this one my rectangle. Close that up. And if we hit run script, we see there is our rectangle right there. Great. So that's what we did last time. But if we want to be able to actually interact with the thing that we just created, we need to create it into a variable like this. We'll say var for variable, and then we'll say my rectangle equals API primitive rectangle, my rectangle. Okay, so now when we run this script, it still shows up the same as always, but we can add things to the script to actually influence this shape. So for example, if we want to now change the rotation of our rectangle when it gets spawned, we would just add in on another line API.set, and then in parentheses the object that we want to reference, which is my rectangle. And this does not go in quotes, comma, curly braces, and we're going to say in quotations rotation, and then colon, the amount that we want. So 45, and then we close that up and finish that. And so if we run the script, we see that our square, our rectangle, now gets created at a 45-degree angle. And basically with API.set, we can pick any attribute that we want and we can update it. We can also stack multiple changes at once by separating the attribute value pairs with a comma like this. So after rotation 45, we do comma, and then we can say position.x, and then let's give it something like 500. So now when we run the script, we see it gets spawned over here, and if we look inside, we see that the x is at 500. Now for the position value, you don't have to do position.x and position.y. What we can actually do is we can update this to just say position and then colon. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add an array, which you can do using the square brackets. So we do square bracket, and then the first position is x. So let's say 400. And then the second position is y. Let's say 500. So let's just delete the rectangle we already have in there, run the script, and we will see that my rectangle is at 400 on the x and 500 on the y. You might be wondering, how do we know what all these attributes are called? And how do we know that we can do position as an array versus just position x and position y? A good way to figure that out and to double check that you have things written correctly is to just right click on the attribute that you want and go down to copy scripting path, and this will show you the options. So in position, we have just position or position x or position y. And if you click on it, it will actually copy it to the clipboard. And if we go down here to this button, we can open up our log and just pull that out. So we see copied attribute path position. We would just have to know that if you only use position, there are two variables here. And so it's going to call for two, and you just have to put it into an array. Now, a better example of why it's important to do the right click and copy scripting path is because if we want to change the color of the rectangle, it is not actually color. So let's go to fill, and we can see here, we might think that it's color because that's what the attribute name is, but if you right click and copy scripting path, you'll see there's a bunch of things. So there's material color dot RGBA and material color. I'm not 100% sure why RGBA is in there twice. I think that might just be something that they need to clean out, but it is not color, it is material color. I'm going to take a quick sidetrack to show you how I go about solving problems with code, and when things aren't working the way that I think they should, or if I'm getting unexplained errors, how I approach solving those problems. So at first, if we go into an existing shape, go to color, right click, and go to copy scripting path, and we see material color. Awesome. Let's do API.set, my rectangle, and then go material color. And then what we're going to do is inside of our array, because we know that has multiple values, we will do the red value, the green value, the blue value, and then the alpha. So let's delete this rectangle, and then run script. And okay, so it's still gray. And if we look at our log window, we see no attribute with this path exists, material color. Well, that's kind of strange, right? Because if we go in here and we right click and we look here, it says material color. So what's going on? Well, it's important to actually click on these, and we'll see that it actually says the attribute path is material.material color. And this is because the fill is actually a generator that is attached to this object. So it is a material generator, and within that it has the attribute material color. So in order to actually access this generator attribute, we have to say that it is material color. Okay, so now let's delete this rectangle and let's run our script. But now when we look at this, we say, well, this isn't even close to the color that I put in, right? Red is at 255, it should be really red. So we go in here and we take a look. Red is at 1, green is at 244, blue is at 56, and alpha is at 206. None of that makes sense with what we put in. If we check the documentation, go to the API module, do Command F and do material color, it shows us only 2 examples. And when we look at the material color, it actually, they're just using a hex code for both of these examples. So that's great that you can use a hex code, but what if we want to use RGB? It seems like we should be able to use RGB because these are the fields that are here, and we know that we can do position and it has fields. What I've learned over time is that it's important to be able to use code to help figure out some of these things. And I'm sure that more experienced coders have better and easier ways of doing this, but this is how I approach things. And it's where our next function comes into play. In order to find out how to set the colors properly, we can always get the colors from something that exists first, just to see how the data is formatted. So what we can do is we can generate the my rectangle shape like normal, and then we can use the console log to see what's inside of it. So let's comment out this API.set function for now. And underneath, what we're going to do after we create the my rectangle variable, we're going to say console.log, and then inside of this we are going to run the get function. So this is API.get, and what do we want to get? We want to reference my rectangle, and then we want to get the material color. Make sure that that is in parentheses. Close that, do that. So now when we run the script, we see here in our log window that we get JavaScript object. And that is also not very helpful, but that's because what it's returning is actually a JSON array with objects inside of it. So we know that it's an array from the brackets. So now we just need to figure out how do we actually see what this JSON object is. And thankfully there's some native JavaScript functions to work with JSON. So in this case, what we want to do is we actually want to store the color data in a variable and then use JSON stringify to make it human readable. So what we'll do is above the console log, we will create another variable, and this we will just call color data, and then it equals, and let's just move this line here, this API.get, we'll just paste that up here. So the color data is now going to equal the material.material color of my rectangle. And then in console log, what we do is we do all caps JSON and then dot stringify. And what do we want it to stringify? We want it to stringify the color data, and make sure that that's all closed up, hit run script. And so now down here, we can see that what it's looking for is in curly braces, it expects A in quotations, colon, then the value, then comma, and then B in quotations, colon, value, comma, etc. We will do our curly braces, and we will say A, so it starts with alpha instead of red, colon, let's say 50. And then we have our blue value, which in our example is going to be 200, comma. And then we have our green value, which we will just do at 12. And then we have finally our red value at 255. and then close that up, curly brackets, run our script, and now we see we have our rectangle, rotation 45, and if we look at the fill color, red 255, green 12, blue 200, alpha at 50, all of that is correct because we now have the correct format. So let's keep adding some attributes to our set function just to see how things stack up. And as we were typing this out, it can get kind of confusing to look at, but we can break these out into separate lines as long as the parentheses at the start and the end are okay, it will still run. So I'm just going to copy and paste this from my example here. We have all of these things, the line is broken up weird, it's confusing to look at. But like I said, as long as everything is sort of in the correct order, it doesn't actually matter what line it's on. So here after this comma, if we just add a line return and add a line return here and here and here, and then we can select all of these, tab it out a couple of times, and now it's a little bit easier to actually read. So here I'm setting the color, the rotation, the position, and here I'm also setting dimension X in the generator and the corner radius. And so where that comes from is in the shape here, we have our size for our square and our radius, our corner radius. And so again, we can just right click and say copy scripting path, dimensions X. And in our log window, we see it says generator.dimensions.x. And so we just put that in. And so now if we delete this old one, run script, we can see that our rectangle now has a size of 500 in the X, and it has a corner radius of 50, which we set here. The position has changed, the rotation has changed, all that stuff has changed. Super great. Now inside of our shape generator, we have radius mode, and that is a drop-down. So when you are interacting with drop-downs, you can think of it as an array of options. And so all would start at 0 and individual would start at 1. So if we wanted to change that, and I've just copied and pasted this again, so what we can do is say generator dimensions X is 500, but the radius mode, which is this drop-down, is 1. And then the radius bottom, so if we take a look at this, if we change this to individual, right? If we right click and do copy scripting path, you can do the radius bottom and the radius top. So I have the radius bottom set to 125 and the radius top set to 125. I'm actually going to swap these here. So it's 25 and 100. So let's delete my rectangle, run the script again, and you'll see that it has changed the radius mode to individual, and it has updated these values. So now we get this kind of shape instead. Now let's go ahead and add a stroke in. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a comma and then just paste for my notes. So let's get this formatted down here as well. Tab these out so it matches everything else. So we have stroke color, the same thing as our fill color, and stroke width. So we're going to change that. And again, you just go over to your stroke, you can right click, get the scripting path, and you see it says stroke color and the width, right? And if you actually click on that, you'll see that it is stroke.width, which is what we have here. So let's go ahead and delete this rectangle and run the script again. But now we see there is no stroke. What's going on, right? So we go into our rectangle and we see that the stroke is off, it's not active, and none of the updates have actually happened. So this is an issue where the set function can access the generator's content, but the actual generator settings can't be accessed through the set function. So even though we have our stroke information being set in the function, and we know that that should work because it works for our fill, it's not actually going through because the generator is turned off, and there's no way to turn a generator on using the set function. And the reason that it's okay for the fill is because the fill generator defaults to being on anytime a shape is created. So you can just go right into changing its settings. But the stroke is default set to off. In order to actually change the stroke functions, we need to turn the generator on first and then set its settings. What we need for this specific instance is a command that is API.set stroke, and then we are referencing my rectangle. and we are setting that to true. So now if we delete this one out here and we run the script again, we see that it spawns with a stroke because we are turning the stroke generator on before we are setting any of these things. And this also works for the fill, except it's slightly different. It's API.set fill my rectangle, and here we're going to set it false because it defaults to being on. So now if we delete this one, run our script, we see we have the stroke and no fill. But what you'll also notice is that if you go into the fill tab, that the color is still the default color. So even though these commands are here, if a generator is off, then it will not update the information. These generators are specific to fill and stroke, but there are other generators that you might want to change the information of, and for that we would use a different function. So like here, this shape type is rectangle, but this is actually a shape generator attribute. So the shape type cannot be changed through API.set. So what we have to do, and I'm just going to do it after our main set command for this one, we'll just do API.set generator. And so in here, again, we are referencing my rectangle, comma, and then what referencing, which is the shape generator. And then what we're actually referencing is this shape generator. But in order to know what it's called, we need to right click on shape type and do copy scripting path, and we see that it is a generator. So in here, in quotations, we say generator, and then what we want is to set the shape, right? So right now it's set to rectangle, and let's say that we want to set it to ellipse. However, if we just put in ellipse here, it's not going to work. So again, what you need to do is you need to right click and say copy generator type. And so here we see that the type, after I've changed it to ellipse, is ellipse shape. And if I go back to rectangle, copy generator type, we see it's rectangle shape. So the word that it's looking for here has to end in shape. So here, change it to ellipse shape, and then go ahead and close that up. So now let's delete this old one, run the script, and we see that it has done all of these things, and then it turns it into an ellipse. So if we go here, it is ellipse, but we can see that because this command, the API.set command, updated the generator while it was still in rectangle mode, if we go to rectangle, we will see that these changes have actually been saved because they happened before we set it to ellipse shape. If we set it to ellipse shape first, then it would have trouble because the ellipse doesn't have a radius mode or a radius top or bottom. Okay, so earlier when we were trying to figure out how to set the color information, we used the function API.get. And basically how that works is API.get, and then you're going to say which object you want to reference. And if you're storing something in a variable, it will not have the quotation marks around it. And then the next thing that would have quotation marks around it is which attribute. With any object that you're working on, anytime you want to get something, you reference the object and then you reference which attribute that you want to get. And you will probably always want to save this into some sort of variable so that you can then reference that attribute later on. Now, if we go back to the documentation and do a search for API.get, we'll see that there's actually a lot of different get functions. So the basic one is what I showed you, get, what are you getting it from, and what attribute is it. But you can also get a frame that you're on, get comp layers of a specific type. You can get layers nice names, you can get time markers, you can get render queue items. There's many different specific get functions, and I'm not going to go over all of them in this video. Make sure to just look through the documentation, and that should be good enough to get you started on them. And comment down below if there's a specific get function that you want me to do a video on. Okay, so the last thing to cover in this video will be the connect function, and it's pretty simple, but it's probably one of the most important functions since Cavalry is all about connecting things. And the way to look at it is you're going to say API.connect, and then the first thing is going to be the source. So you're going to say comma, and then in quotations, which attribute you want to have as the source. And then you want the destination object or layer, comma, and then the destination attribute. So this is how the function is set up and how you would use it. So for this example, let's create a noise node and connect it to the rectangle's rotation. And then we will also add a duplicator and finally hide the original shape so that it doesn't interfere with the final image. First, I'm going to make the rectangle a little bit smaller. So what I'm going to do here is instead of dimensions.x, I'm just going to say dimensions, and then in brackets, we will do 150, 150. That'll make that a little bit smaller, a little bit easier to manage. And we can see if we comment this out, run the script, now our thing looks like that, kind of like a lemon. And so the first thing that we need to do is actually create our noise node. So let's create a variable, we'll call it noisy equals API.create. Now this is the other way to create things. So I think I mentioned this last time, API primitive is useful for creating shapes, but API.create is used to create basically everything else. So we say API.create. The node that we want to create is a noise node. We will just name it noisy. That's fine. So now we have created our noise node. And again, we can test this. We just run the script and we see there's our noise node. Great. So let's leave both of these. Next, we want to actually set the attributes for the noise node. So again, just like the other one, API.set. What are we setting? We are setting noisy. In brackets, we're going to say generator.minimum, and we will do -45. And then generator.maximum is 45. And again, we just get these values by creating a noise node, right-clicking, copy scripting path, and just seeing kind of what's there. Next up, let's create our duplicator. So variable myDup equals API.create duplicator, comma, what's the name? myDup, doesn't matter. And then here we will set some settings. So API.set my duplicator, curly brackets. We're going to set the generator size, and here I'm setting the X and Y size at the same time. So in brackets, we'll just do 200, comma, 200 brackets, comma. Next, we will do generator.count. And again, this has two values. So we're just going to do 9 and 4. And then finally, generator.distribution mode. And we're going to set that to 1. Again, that's a drop-down list. So it's going to be from 0 to however many items are in that list. And then curly bracket, parentheses, semicolon. So now if we just run that, it'll create everything, but nothing is actually connected together yet. So let's do API.connect, and we're going to connect my rectangle, the ID of the rectangle. And you can think of ID as the output of a layer. So if you're going to drag and drop this layer into the duplicator, that would be dragging and dropping the ID. Or if you're going to grab on the little connector here, you can think of the output of this spot as the ID as well. So we're taking the rectangle's ID, and then we're going to put it into the duplicator, into its shapes attribute. Close that up. And then finally, we want to connect the noisy node. And again, this is the ID because it's the output of that noise node. And we're going to put this into the duplicator, and we want to put it into the shape rotation so that each individual shape will rotate independently. Close close that up, and we can delete this because that was just for reference. So now if we run this, we get a bunch of shapes, and if we play it, we see that they are all rotating individually. So you can see everything is rotating exactly what we want. And if we look into here, we can double check minimum, maximum, minus 45, 45, the duplicator, you know, the counts, the size mode, everything has been updated just like we want. Now the last step to this is that the my rectangle shape is still actually visible. It's just hanging out back there. So if we want to hide things, so we're going to do API.set, and we're looking at my rectangle, comma, and then in curly brackets, we just say hidden is the attribute, and we want to set that to true, curly brackets, close that up, close that up. So let's delete all these things here and run the script. And now we see everything else is still the same, and our rectangle is hidden. So that's the basics of how you can set attributes, get attributes, and connect attributes. Next time, we're going to look at how to make a graphical interface for your plugin. So make sure to tune in for that, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't so you don't miss it. And if you learned something, go ahead and like this video, and I will see you next time.